Okay, we're going to close it up with Leo one more time.
All right. I don't see any tomatoes on the floor, so I'm in good shape to give another talk, huh? I'm Leo, and I'm here not to talk about kids or health. I'm here to talk about money. And let's face it, the reason we're here is that there are companies that are spending money and making money by producing chemicals used in food packaging of all different types and all sorts of plastics. And the argument we usually hear when people suggest that there might be consequences to using these chemicals for our health, they'll say, well, it'll hurt our economy if we fix this. So just let's move on. But we know that chemicals that mess with our hormones, our natural signaling molecules, can cost us all and cost our economy. I'm going to first broaden the conversation beyond chemicals used in food packaging and then come back in to food packaging just as an alert. So we did a series of studies back in 2014 and 2015, had the privilege of working with Pete on that, among many others. And we pulled together a series of expert panels to look at the costs of endocrine-disrupting chemicals. And we focused first in Europe because that's where there was, even then, this was before 2016, there was a lot more action in that space, and there was active decision-making involved. But the industry kept saying, well, we need a risk assessment. We need to understand how much this is going to cost our society if we actually do the right thing. And what we found is that endocrine-disrupting chemicals cost Europe 163 billion euros a year. That's 1.2% of its gross domestic product. And mind you, that estimate was based on less than 5% of the known endocrine-disrupting chemicals, a subset of the diseases due to those endocrine-disrupting chemicals, and a subset of costs due to those diseases due to the few chemicals we studied. So this is a big old lowball estimate. Therefore, at the very least, we know that preventing these chemical exposures can not just improve people's lives, but save us large amounts of money that may actually be worth it to spend some money for a change on preventing these exposures in the first place. Now, we're here in good old Northern California, and as an American and as a dad and as a pediatrician, I came back on one of those flights back from Europe, a little jet lagged, thinking, well, I need to do this in the U.S. I want to understand how it's affecting me. I've got an 11-year-old and a 9-year-old at home. And so we did these analyses over again in the U.S., and the costs were on the order of $340 billion a year. That's 2.3% of our gross domestic product. So that speaks to the huge impact these exposures can have on our broader economy. The message often is, and the biggest driver of those costs are the impacts on kids' brains. And if a child comes back home with one less IQ point, I wouldn't notice as a pediatrician. No offense to the mothers out there. No offense, Shori. Mom might not notice. Psychologist might not notice. Teacher might not notice. But if 100,000 kids come back with one less IQ point, the entire economy notices. Each IQ point's worth roughly 2% of a child's lifetime economic productivity. And let's say it's $1 million over his or her lifetime on average, leaving aside the extremes. On average, that's $20,000 an IQ point. 4 million kids born each year, multiply that by 20,000, you've got a whole lot of zeros. That's $80 billion for just one IQ point alone. And when you take a deeper look at it, policies predict exposure. Exposure contributes to disease, and disease ultimately costs us all. And there's some big differences between the U.S. and Europe about these exposures. One of the legacies that we are still living from not doing the right thing, which I think is important to think about even though it's about flame retardant chemicals, it really speaks to the forever chemicals and the long-term consequences of failing to do the right thing in that regard. So back in the 70s, during the tobacco war, we thought about preventing fires, and so we sprayed every piece of furniture and its upholstery with flame retardants. California required it as a standard for its flammability. So Europe didn't do that. So if I took all the Europeans, put them on one side of the room, put the Americans on the other side of the room, the Americans' blood flame retardant levels would be the 95th percentile compared to of the European group on average. So there would literally be a phase shift where the levels of flame retardants would be much higher. And that ultimately translates to much bigger costs. The cost of flame retardants on kids' brains and their development is $282 billion in the U.S., and it's in the range of a few $billion in Europe. So that speaks to the differences. Now, for the Europeans, I've got the opposite story on pesticides, but I'm moving on to food packaging. When you look more carefully at the impacts on food packaging chemicals, the numbers aren't so big, but the effects are various and sundry. We're talking about, Pete already talked about obesogens, phthalate increases in adult obesity, phthalate increases in adult diabetes. We're talking about phthalates that literally delay pregnancy in couples who are actually trying to conceive, and increases in assisted reproductive technology. We're talking about bisphenol A and childhood obesity. We've been talking and dancing around phthalates and having cute jokes about sperm count. And it also affects potency, which is important. But this can literally be a life or death matter because phthalates decrease testosterone in adult males. And insofar as low T is either a marker for or a predictor of adult cardiovascular disease, that can increase cardiovascular disease and stroke. 10,000 U.S. men between the ages of roughly 55 and 64 die each year as a result of phthalate-induced decreases in testosterone. Not to mention that's an $8 billion cost. Therefore, we've got impacts that run all across the lifespan. I mean, I'm a pediatrician, but this affects me as a rising adult male and all of us. And the implications here are potentially even greater given that we were barely scratching the surface in these estimates. And so let me pivot to some hope, because often what people say is, well, you can't even by reducing these exposures do anything. But there's evidence from at least one step. So Linda in her presentation last night talked about the perfluoroalkyl substances, the long chain ones. And I'm not saying that the phase out or the voluntary shift down from the perfluoroalkyl substances, the long chain ones, really sealed the deal about those exposures. They're still out there. But we did a study comparing low birth weight due to perfluoroalkyl substances in 2003 to 4, and then looked at the low birth weights due to perfluoroalkyl substances in 2013 to 14. 14,500. $4 billion a year, $340 million a year. So that may not seem like big money to people, but that again speaks to the fact of proactive efforts to do the right thing, not the perfect thing. We've had regrettable substitution that probably washes out some of the benefits that we've talked about in money and in people's lives. But that speaks to the reality that these can have huge consequences for our health and our economy. I'm going to use one example to put this as a side-by-side, because often industry says, well, okay, you can give me big dollar numbers, but it's going to be big dollar numbers to replace these with safer alternatives. Let's go back to BPA as an example. Now, let's imagine a universe where we substituted BPA with oleoresin, a naturally derived alternative, or you come up with one free of health effects. We're going to make a mythical box, chemical free of health effects used for aluminum cans. We looked at just 2 disease outcomes, obesity in kids and cardiovascular disease in adults. And eliminating the health effects associated with BPA directly from cans would save roughly about $1.7 billion a year. Oleoresin, to use one example, is 2.2 cents on the can, 100 billion cans a year. That's $2.2 billion in costs. So we're nearly at a wash when you're talking about that. And that's based on 2 disease outcomes due to this chemical which seems to be associated with a host of other things, not to mention the ovarian effects and other things that we haven't even talked about here. Therefore, when we're talking about the trade-offs, that speaks to something I think of a lot. I think I'll admit I'm dating myself by saying this. I watched West Wing way too much for my own good. I did watch the other one, the House of Cards thing that followed that, but that's depressing. But there's an episode in West Wing, I think season 5, where there's literally there's an environmental NGO sitting down with one of the chief of staff for deputy chief of staff for President Bartlett, and they're arguing over a decision whether to prevent an environmental exposure. I can't remember what it is at this point, but the argument that's made that Bartlett's deputy chief of staff makes is, well, what are the benefits to preventing this exposure? What's the business case for doing the right thing? And so I'll leave you with the fact that we can't be afraid of putting these dollar numbers on the table, even if we have to couch them in the context of a lot of uncertainty that's out there, because the science is constantly catching up. And so with that, I guess I'm the thing keeping you from lunch, so I will pass the baton from here. Thank you.
Thank you.